you had told me 10 years ago that I experienced or witnessed emotional abuse, I would have answered, what is emotional abuse? I never knew what it was, and the reality is most people have a hard time grasping the concept of emotional abuse. And that's why we're here today. It's time we talk about the problem of emotional abuse, because if we don't, we are allowing it to continue across generations. 6 years ago, I came to the United States from Madagascar. I enrolled at a community college, I majored in psychology, and I became a peer educator. It was actually during my training that I first heard about emotional abuse. Before that, the only forms of abuse that I knew of were physical and sexual abuse. I remember through the training, I learned that emotional abuse is also known as psychological abuse. It is any form of abuse that is not physical. It is done repeatedly and consists of belittlement, criticism, insults, humiliation, or put-downs. One of the examples that was given was when someone keeps on pointing out your flaws without encouraging or supporting your growth. Some signs are even harder to detect, such as subtle jokes and sarcasm. It's when people repeatedly belittle you with hurtful comments and then they say that it was just a joke, or when you try to share your feelings and they tell you that you're too sensitive. Emotional abuse can also be repetitive intimidation, guilt-tripping, manipulation, or control. I was shocked to recognize these behaviors. I knew each one of them, but I never knew that if done repeatedly, it was considered emotional abuse. That was my first eye-opener, because I began to realize that all my life, I had grown up in an emotionally abusive environment without realizing it. In my country, it's common to walk down the street and see couples fight or parents yell at their children. Nobody says anything. Even those doing the yelling and the name-calling, they don't realize it is wrong because that's just the way it has been. These behaviors are in plain sight, but completely unseen. It never occurred to most of us that it could be different. Another thing that really struck me was when I learned that emotional abuse has a direct and tremendous impact on an individual's sense of identity, dignity, self-esteem, and mental health. That these consequences are long-lasting, devastating, and all too common. That was my second aha moment, because suddenly so many things finally made sense. My lack of confidence, lack of self-love, lack of boundaries, and my fear of taking risks, because I was too afraid to be criticized. I was conditioned to think that whatever I did wasn't good enough, so why even try? I felt lonely in my experience, but I soon found out I was not alone. According to UNICEF, around 80% of children in Madagascar have experienced emotional abuse in their household. This statistic is shocking. 80%. 80% represent about 9 million children. Once I recognized the scale, I knew that something had to be done. So I began talking with peers, relatives, and experts, and I even posted a video on my social media where I discussed the prevalence of the problem in my country. I was expecting a backlash, but instead, the video went viral, not only in my country, but all around the world. Hundreds of people from different countries such as China, India, Brazil, Pakistan, Morocco, even here in the US, people reached out to me because they could relate to the problem I was talking about. They even shared their stories of abuse within their families, at school, at work, in their romantic relationships. And after years of extensive interviewing and research, what I found opened my eyes to just how profoundly emotional abuse shapes our lives. I've discovered that emotional abuse is a systemic problem that exists everywhere in the world. And in developing countries like mine, it is a cultural norm passed down from generation to generation. It generally starts in the household and can have a spillover effect on the other relationships in our lives. In our most intimate relationships, we are the most vulnerable, and emotional abuse sneaks in. If we don't recognize it, it becomes an intergenerational curse. Here's the problem with emotional abuse being passed down through generations. Victims of abuse struggle to reach their full potential because they experience low self-esteem, which can lead to trouble establishing and maintaining healthy relationships. Victims of emotional abuse have a hard time accepting genuine affection because they have a distorted view of what love is and isn't. In relation to that, victims usually end up in codependent relationships and are constantly looking for people's approval and attention because they are trying to fill a void that could not be filled growing up. For victims, setting boundaries is so scary that they are more likely subject to people pleasing. Because of their trauma, victims often experience anxiety, depression, and isolation, which impacts all areas of their lives. And most importantly, people who have experienced abuse may perpetuate it themselves in their future relationships because hurt people hurt other people. Now, imagine these consequences on a single individual and now scale it to 80% of the entire population, 4 out of every 5 people. This creates an unhealthy and fearful society not able to reach its full potential. And without awareness and action, this cycle will not end. Luckily, we each hold the power to break the cycle of emotional abuse. And if we start with ourselves, we can begin to tackle a much larger global problem. I began reflecting on what role I could play in not only reversing the harms caused by emotional abuse, but in preventing it for future generations. And from these reflections emerged UMEN. I started UMEN in 2019, and we exist to prevent and break the cycle of emotional abuse worldwide. We envision a world with a more empathetic generation with greater self-esteem and inner strength that is capable of fostering healthy relationships. In my native Malagasy language, Umen is a play on words. Umena means give, provide, and Mena means red. Our mission is built in our name. We break the cycle of abuse by providing children and young adults with the social, emotional learning tools to spot the red flags in unhealthy relationships. The first and most important step in preventing the problem is putting a name on the toxic behaviors. This will allow us to recognize emotional abuse. Out of the 700 students we've reached in Madagascar, 98% of them didn't know what emotional abuse is. Our first step was putting a name on behaviors that they thought were normal. Our second approach is to teach students about the signs of a healthy relationship and the skill to build them. You see, when youth learn that a healthy relationship is not based on control, extreme jealousy, belittlement, or manipulation, they can begin to notice when these unhealthy behaviors show up in their interactions with others. At the end of our workshops, most of the time the students come to me because they realize that their own behaviors have been unhealthy or toxic. Once the students have a new understanding on what a healthy interaction and a healthy relationship should look like, they can take actions towards improving their own behaviors, advocating for themselves, or sometimes making the hard decision to end relationships that are painful or damaging. Our third approach is to provide children with the emotional literacy to recognize their own emotions and the emotions of others. We teach children at a young age about one of the simplest yet most important tools, the language of emotion. When people can recognize and identify their emotions as well as others, it opens the door for more understanding and empathy. In other words, when we build children's intelligence, social emotional intelligence, we encourage sensitivity, vulnerability, and honesty. And emotional intelligence fuels healthy friendships, leads to better decision-making, and increases children's capacity to express themselves. When we can express our emotions with empathy, we disrupt that pattern of violence. And when we disrupt that pattern, we improve the mental health and well-being of children, families, and communities. On that note, I want to leave you with 3 messages for each of you listening. 1. If you have been in an emotionally abusive relationship, please know that there are ways to reclaim your life and begin the healing journey. Make sure you surround yourself with supportive people. My personal journey was not easy, but my family and I tried our best to learn together and find solutions to move forward. We discussed emotional management, behaviors that would impact us in certain ways, how we are feeling as a result, and we held each other accountable. Slowly, we shifted and began to move towards healing. There is hope for you too. 2. If you're realizing that your own behaviors have been toxic and abusive, please know the first step is recognizing the abuse for what it is. Putting a name on something and realizing you're not alone is powerful. You have the potential to become more healthy. It's going to take some serious relearning and a lot of self-work, but it is possible. There is hope. 3. If you're learning about emotional abuse for the first time and want to keep learning, or you are an ally committed to breaking the cycle, you can join organizations like UMEN. If you want to learn more about our work, or if you want to join the movement, follow us on social media at UMEN Movement. Finally, always remember there is hope in ending the generational consequences of emotional abuse. There is hope, and hope begins with you. Thank you.